Under the heavy canopy of towering trees, the campground sat in a stillness that was almost unnerving. The night had come quickly, as it always did in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest. The campers had retreated to their cabins, the rustling of the leaves above the only sound, blending with the occasional distant call of an owl. The air was cool, thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. Somewhere, the stars above shone faintly, but their light could hardly reach the thick shadows cast by the massive trees. At Camp Shasta, nestled deep in the woods, everything seemed normal. 5 young camp counselors sat outside the mess hall, laughing softly as they shared stories. Flickering light from the campfire danced across their faces, their smiles young and full of the innocent excitement that only summer could bring. Their names were engraved in the memories of many: Tom, Sarah, Greg, Ashley, and Chloe. Each one of them had come to the camp with a different story, some seeking to reconnect with their own childhood, some to escape from the weight of personal struggles, others to embrace the adventure of a summer spent in the woods. But tonight, none of them had any idea that the carefree moments they shared would soon become their last. First whispers of unease began in the silence that followed their laughter. Something was off, though no one could put their finger on it. The forest, normally vibrant with the sounds of creatures scurrying about, seemed too still, too quiet. It was not a fear they could easily articulate, just an odd, prickling sensation that brushed against the edges of their minds. No one spoke of it aloud. They continued their conversations, and for a while, everything felt normal again. Then, at around midnight, something changed. It was a sudden shift, almost imperceptible, like the moment before a storm breaks. Chloe, the youngest of the counselors, had stepped away to check on one of the cabins. She did not return. It was not out of character. Chloe had always been the one to wander off, drawn to the mysteries of the forest. But this time, as the hours passed and the others noticed her absence, a quiet tension started to build. She should have been back by now. The clock ticked on. First, the others assumed she was just taking a longer walk, perhaps lost in thought, or having a conversation with one of the campers. But as time went on, their initial concern morphed into something more acute, a sense that something was not right. They called out to her, their voices carrying through the still air. There was no answer. At first, it felt like the woods themselves had swallowed Chloe whole, as if the trees had quietly closed in around her and no one would ever see her again. The group of counselors exchanged nervous glances, hesitant to voice the growing dread that gripped them. Tom, the group's leader, suggested they check the cabins and the nearby trails. They agreed, though unease clung to them like a second skin. The air had grown colder, and an overwhelming sense of isolation filled the space between their words. The campgrounds, usually so vibrant, now seemed desolate. Empty, flickering light of the campfire cast elongated shadows that crept eerily across the paths. Every rustle of leaves sounded like a whisper, every distant thud a threat. They moved cautiously, checking one cabin after another, searching the path that led deeper into the woods, calling out for Chloe. No sign of her. Minutes turned into hours, and by the time the clock struck 2:30 a.m., a deep, gnawing panic began to set in. Sarah, who had always been the most grounded of the group, suggested they call the authorities. But Tom hesitated. The decision was not easy. In the back of his mind, he wondered if they were overreacting. Chloe had a tendency to disappear into the woods for hours at a time, exploring, finding solace in the quiet of nature. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he could not shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong this time. The darkness seemed to close in around them as they huddled together on the outskirts of the camp. The forest beyond was an imposing mass of shadows and silence. It was then that they realized they were not alone. It was not the crunch of a footstep or the snap of a branch, but something far subtler. Something that sent chills creeping down their spines. It was the feeling that they were being watched. A presence just beyond the edges of their vision, fleeting and elusive, like a shadow that would not fully take shape. Greg, who was always the skeptic, dismissed it at first. "You are all just freaked out," he muttered. "It is the force messing with your heads." But even he, with his bravado, could not ignore the prickle of fear creeping up his neck. The woods were different tonight. Something about them had changed. With a shared resolve, the group pressed on, Venturing deeper into the darkness, they reached the edge of the forest, where a small stream ran, its gurgling sound the only thing that cut through the thick quiet. Chloe was not there. They shouted her name again, but their voices barely seemed to travel. The trees loomed over them like silent sentinels, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms. A few more hours passed in a blur of searching, panic, and mounting dread. There was no sign of Chloe, no sound other than their own footsteps and shallow breaths. When they finally returned to the camp, broken and exhausted, it was clear to all of them that something had happened. Something that none of them could explain. But what was most unsettling of all was the absence of something they had not even thought to notice before. The sound of the forest had vanished. The crickets, the rustling of animals, even the soft, ever-present breeze, all gone. The woods were silent, as if holding its breath, waiting for something that none of them could anticipate. They could hear only the beating of their own hearts and the terrifying, empty space that stretched between them and the world beyond. They did not know it then, but the vanishing of Chloe was just the beginning. And what followed would not only tear apart their world, but the very fabric of everything they thought they knew about the camp, the woods, and the people they had trusted. What started as a simple disappearance would unravel into a mystery that no one would be prepared for, because at that moment, something darker than they could ever have imagined was stirring in the shadows, and they were already too deep to turn back. The morning after Chloe's disappearance was strangely quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears, filling the air with something unspoken. The sun had risen, casting a soft, golden light over the campgrounds, but the usual warmth of a summer day felt distant, as if the earth itself had forgotten how to breathe. The other counselors, exhausted from their long search through the night, sat in a dazed haze as the first rays of light fell on the empty paths where Chloe had walked just hours before. They had come back empty-handed, each of them holding onto a thread of hope that perhaps they had just missed her, that she might have wandered off in some forgotten direction, lost in the maze of trees. But as the minutes stretched into hours, that hope began to fray. There was something about the way the camp looked this morning that did not seem right. Empty, abandoned, like the very heart of it had been sucked out. The laughter of campers seemed distant, as if it belonged to another time, another place. The soft breeze that usually filled the air with a sense of calm now felt oppressive, suffocating. Each breath seemed to carry a weight, as though the world was holding its breath along with them. Tom was the first to break the silence. His voice, though steady, betrayed the exhaustion he felt. He looked out at the empty camp with a sense of disbelief, as though he could not reconcile the scene before him with the reality he had known just days ago. "She will turn up," he said, though his words lacked conviction. He was trying to convince himself as much as the others. Sarah nodded, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly. She had always been the pragmatic one, the one who could read the signs and keep her head. But even she felt the shifting weight in the air. Something was wrong, something beyond Chloe just getting lost. Greg, who had spent the night stubbornly maintaining that it was all a prank or some kind of misunderstanding, now looked uneasy. He was pacing in front of the mess hall, his hands running through his hair as he muttered under his breath. "It is not like her," he repeated, the words sounding more like a question than a statement. He would known Chloe for a long time. She was impulsive, sure, but never reckless. If she had wandered off, she would have left a trail, something, anything, by which they could follow. But there was nothing. Not a trace. Ashley sat at one of the wooden picnic tables, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as if holding herself together. She stared at the ground, her thoughts a whirl of confusion and worry. She had always been the one who noticed the little things, the ones that no one else saw. And right now, her gut was screaming at her. Something did not add up. It was not just the absence of Chloe. It was the way the whole camp felt, as if the trees themselves were leaning in, watching, waiting for something. The shadows seemed deeper today, darker, and though she could not quite put her finger on it, she could feel the forest pressing against her, a presence that was far from welcoming. The campers, who had awoken to the disappearance of one of their counselors, had gathered in small, worried groups near the cabins, whispered among themselves, casting furtive glances at the woods. Others stood frozen, their eyes wide with a mix of fear and curiosity. Older campers, many of them familiar with the camp's routines, tried to keep things calm, but even their voices cracked with unease. By midday, the decision was made to inform the authorities. The sheriff's department was alerted, and soon a small team of officers arrived, their vehicles kicking up the dust of the dirt roads as they rolled into the camp. For a brief moment, the sight of them brought a flicker of hope. There would be answers, they thought. There had to be. The group had grown desperate, clinging to the idea that the police, with their expertise, would be able to make sense of what had happened. The officers were kind but direct, asking the counselors for every detail they could provide about Chloe's last known whereabouts, her behavior leading up to the night of her disappearance, anything that might shed light on what had happened. They were thorough, asking questions that seemed to dig into the smallest moments of their memories, as if the smallest detail could unlock the mystery of the forest. No one could remember anything unusual. There was nothing that stood out, no sign that anything was out of place. One of the officers, an older man with gray hair and a sharp gaze, seemed particularly focused on the group's reactions. He watched them closely as they spoke, his eyes narrowing when they mentioned the strange feeling in the woods. First, he dismissed it as nerves, the anxiety of a missing person. But as the day wore on and more of the camp's inhabitants spoke of the same eerie stillness in the air, something in his demeanor shifted. He suggested, reluctantly, that they widen the search, bringing in more personnel. There were theories, of course, none of them pleasant, but no answers. The feeling of unease was becoming too hard to ignore. As the day progressed, the search expanded further into the woods. The once bright, bustling trails now seemed darker, more ominous, as the trees closed in overhead, blocking the sun's rays from reaching the forest floor. The counselors and officers split into groups, their voices calling out through the trees. But there was still no sign of Chloe. No tracks, no broken branches, no sign of struggle. The sense of isolation that had clung to the camp now felt like a tangible force, pressing down on them from all sides. The distant sound of the river, which usually offered a sense of peace, now felt like the mocking gurgle of a stream that held more secrets than it let on. The woods were swallowing them whole, closing in around them like an impenetrable wall. No one spoke of it openly, but everyone felt it. The forest was vast and relentless, and the search was becoming hopeless. In the hours that followed, the tension only deepened. Conversations grew quieter, and the previously confident counselors began to exchange nervous glances. What if they were not just looking for Chloe anymore? What if they were looking for something else, something far worse? They had all seen the same things, felt the same creeping unease, but no one dared to speak it aloud. The idea that something was watching them, waiting, lingered at the back of their minds, but it was too absurd to entertain, so they pushed it down, burying it beneath the weight of more practical concerns. But as the sun began to dip low in the sky, casting long, stretching shadows across the camp, the feeling intensified. Sarah and Ashley, having ventured further into the woods, returned with an unsettling story. They had wandered down a trail they would never notice before, one that seemed almost too perfect, as though it had been cleared for a reason. It was narrow, winding, and led them to a clearing they did not recognize, where the trees grew unnaturally close together. There, in the middle of the clearing, was a strange object, a small, weathered wooden box, half buried in the underbrush. They had approached it carefully, but the moment they reached out to touch it, a sharp rustle of leaves startled them. They looked up, but no one was there, just the sound of the wind moving through the trees, like an exhale from some unseen force. When they told the others, there was a collective shiver, an unspoken agreement that something was very wrong. The feeling of being watched was not just paranoia. There was something in the woods, something they could not explain. With dusk settling in, the decision was made to call the search off for the night. The group huddled together in the mess hall, the flickering overhead lights casting long shadows on the wooden walls. Tom, his face drawn with exhaustion, finally allowed himself to admit what they had all been trying to deny. "We are not just looking for Chloe anymore," he said quietly. "We are looking for something we do not understand." The others nodded, each of them feeling the weight of the unspoken truth. They were no longer just counselors searching for one of their own. They were lost in a mystery that had nothing to do with missing people and everything to do with the forest itself. And the forest was not giving up its secrets. The days following Chloe's disappearance blurred into an unnerving rhythm of hope and despair. It was not just the uncertainty of where she had gone, but the weight of the forest itself that seemed to press down on the camp, suffocating every breath. What had started as a simple search for a missing person had evolved into something much darker. A haunting feeling lingered in the air, thick and oppressive. There were whispers now, unspoken fears that crawled into the corners of conversations, hidden beneath the layers of well-wishing and forced optimism. Counselors spoke little of it aloud, but the presence of something unknown was palpable. In the days that followed, the camp turned into a hive of activity. Though authorities had done their part, search dogs had been brought in, helicopters had flown over the dense trees, but with each passing hour, there was no trace of Chloe, no clue as to where she had gone. Her disappearance was becoming more of an enigma. The woods, once so welcoming, now seemed to close in on them, as though the trees themselves were hiding something, keeping secrets that no one could uncover. The authorities had initially promised quick results. They had assured the counselors and the remaining campers that Chloe would be found, that there were answers to be had. But the search parties returned each evening empty-handed, tired, and defeated. Forest had swallowed her whole. No footprints, no broken branches, no sounds of struggle, not even a whisper of her voice. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. And with her, the sense of security that had once been so comforting at the camp had evaporated, leaving behind a cold, creeping uncertainty. Tom, ever the leader, tried to remain calm in front of the others, but the cracks in his composure were starting to show. The burden of responsibility weighed heavily on him. He had been the one to organize the search efforts, to guide the counselors through the ever-expanding wilderness, but now it seemed futile. Every trail they followed turned into another dead end. Every call for Chloe went unanswered. The whole situation felt surreal, as though they were trapped in some kind of nightmare, and each step forward only pulled them deeper into its grasp. The idea of a tragic accident seemed too simple. Chloe had disappeared so completely, so utterly, that it felt as though she had been taken. And the more they searched, the more they realized that the camp and the forest surrounding it had become something else, a labyrinth, an unknowable place that did not play by the rules they understood. It was not long before the rumors began to spread. Campers who had never ventured far into the woods spoke in hushed tones about the strange occurrences they had seen, flashes of movement in the distance, shadows that seemed to linger longer than they should. Forest, they said, had always been full of secrets, but now it was as though those secrets had come alive, twisting the trees into strange shapes, bending the very fabric of reality. A sense of dread was growing in the camp, one that no one could quite explain, but everyone could feel. It was as if the forest had become a thing unto itself, a presence that could watch them, listen to them, and even decide their fate. The police, despite their best efforts, were at a loss. They could not explain the disappearance. There was no evidence of foul play, no signs of an abduction, no indication that anything out of the ordinary had taken place. And yet, the mystery of Chloe's vanishing seemed to grow more complicated the more they investigated. They turned to the other counselors for answers, but none of them had seen anything unusual that night. No one had heard a scream, no one had seen a struggle. Chloe had simply been there one moment and gone the next. It was as though the world itself had erased her from existence. As the days stretched on, the community grew restless. The local townspeople, who had known the camp for years, began to murmur about things they would seen, things they would heard. Few spoke of the woods as if they were alive, not just trees and animals, but something ancient, something that had always existed beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. Others spoke of old stories, of strange happenings in the woods that had been passed down through generations, but no one had dared speak of them in years. These were stories of creatures that walked between worlds, spirits that could take you when you least expected it, and of disappearances that never made sense. The more the authorities pressed, the more the local rumors seemed to bubble to the surface, but no one could prove anything. No one could offer a reasonable explanation for the terrifying things that were whispered about. Sarah, normally the one to maintain a sense of order in times of chaos, found herself struggling to hold on to that sense of control. She had been close to Chloe, had seen her grow from a nervous, uncertain girl into a confident, capable counselor. The idea that someone they all cared about could simply disappear into the woods without a trace gnawed at her. She had always been skeptical of the supernatural, always logical, always rational. But as the days passed and the fear in the camp grew, she could not ignore the nagging feeling that something more than a simple disappearance was at play. The woods were hiding something, and Chloe was the key. It was during one of the many nights spent around the fire, the only place where anyone still felt somewhat at ease, that Ashley finally spoke up. Her voice was quiet at first, barely a whisper over the crackling of the flames, but it carried a weight that drew the others closer. She spoke of the strange occurrences she had felt in the woods during their search, an overwhelming sense of being watched, a feeling of something lurking just out of sight. She described how, when they ventured deeper into the forest, she felt a chill in the air that did not come from the wind, a pressure in the atmosphere that made her heart race. There had been moments when the trees themselves seemed to shift, as though they were moving, rearranging. And the most unsettling part, the sensation that the forest itself was somehow alive, aware of their presence. The others listened in stunned silence. Tom shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to respond. Deep down, he knew she was right. There was something wrong with the forest. It was not just the fear of not knowing what had happened to Chloe. It was the way the land felt empty, hollow, like it had been drained of all life and replaced with something else, something dark, something that was waiting for them to stumble into its grasp. Greg, the skeptic, scoffed at the idea. "It is just nerves," he said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "We have been out here too long, we are all losing it." But even as the words left his mouth, he could not help but remember the strange, fleeting glimpse he had caught the day before, something darting between the trees, just out of reach. He had told himself it was a trick of the light, but deep down, he knew he was not sure. For the first time since Chloe's disappearance, the group found themselves grappling with something they had all tried to avoid: fear. It was not just fear of the unknown. It was the fear that the very place they had once thought of as safe, as home, was no longer under their control. The woods were changing them, and the more they searched, the more they realized they were getting closer to a truth that none of them were ready to face. The next day, as the search continued, they ventured farther into the forest. Despite the warnings they had begun to hear from locals, felt like they were moving through a dream. Everything was distorted, the trees too tall, the shadows too dark. The air was thick, suffocating, and the further they went, the more they felt as though the forest itself was pushing them deeper, unwilling to let them turn back. It was as if something in the woods wanted them to keep going, to lose themselves completely in its depths. Hours passed, and still no sign of Chloe. But as the sun began to set, something changed. It was not just the temperature dropping, or the way the light shifted. It was the feeling that something was coming. The trees seemed to bend. The forest exhaled in a way that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. They stopped in their tracks, looking at each other, each person feeling the same sudden urgency to leave. But the path back was no longer clear. It was as if the forest had swallowed it whole. They were lost. But worse than that, they were no longer alone. The forest had become something else, something far more dangerous than any of them had ever imagined. And with that realization came the crushing understanding. They had ventured too far. And now, the forest was not going to let them go. The search, once a hopeful quest to bring Chloe back, had become a grim, endless cycle. As the days stretched on, the atmosphere at the camp grew heavier, weighed down by a creeping sense of hopelessness. It was not just that Chloe was missing, it was the feeling that something else was at play. The more they searched, the more it seemed as if the forest itself was working against them, its vast expanse concealing its secrets with an impenetrable silence. Every effort to find Chloe led to another dead end, another stretch of trees that swallowed their voices and their hope. Tom, ever the leader, had begun to lose his sense of direction. His voice, which had once been the steady beacon that kept the group grounded, was now tinged with uncertainty. Each passing day seemed to unravel him further, the weight of responsibility crushing him from the inside. He had always been the one who others could rely on, the one who had an answer for every problem, a plan for every situation. But now, there were no answers. The plan had long since fallen apart. The search parties returned each evening with nothing, their faces drawn and hopeless. Even the police, who had been called in early on, were at a loss. They had brought in experts, they had combed through the area, but there was still no sign of Chloe. The woods had swallowed her, and no one could understand why or how. The air around the camp had become thick with tension, the kind of tension that settled in your chest and made it hard to breathe. It was not just the fear of the unknown. It was the feeling that something was wrong with the very place they had once found refuge. Forest, so familiar and comforting, had become a labyrinth. Paths seemed to shift. The trees seemed to close in, and the once open trails now felt like traps. It was as if the very land itself was turning against them, twisting the world around them into something unrecognizable. The remaining counselors gathered around the campfire one evening, the flames casting long, flickering shadows across their faces. The nights had grown colder, the air sharp with the bite of autumn despite it still being the summer. The tension between them was palpable, an unspoken understanding that things were no longer just about Chloe. They had become part of something far bigger, something far more terrifying. "I do not understand it," Sarah said, her voice quiet but firm. She had been Chloe's closest friend, and the pain of not knowing where she was or what had happened to her had taken its toll. "It is like she vanished into thin air. There is no trace of her, nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no sounds of a struggle, nothing at all." Tom, sitting across from her, ran a hand through his hair, his face weary. "I know," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "I do not get it either, but we cannot stop. We cannot just give up on her." Greg, who had been silent for most of the evening, suddenly spoke up. His voice was strained, his eyes wide with something like a mixture of fear and disbelief. "But what if she is not out there anymore? What if she is gone?" His words hung in the air, unsettling in their bluntness. The others fell silent. The idea had crossed their minds, of course, but no one had dared to voice it aloud. To even entertain the thought that Chloe was gone, truly gone, was unbearable. But Greg's words had struck a nerve. What if the forest had taken her, as it had taken so many others before? What if it was hiding something, something that had been waiting for the right moment to strike? The thought made the blood run cold. "We have to keep looking," Tom said, his voice harder now, as if trying to convince himself as much as the others. "We cannot stop. We have to believe that she is still out there, that she is still alive." But even as he said the words, he felt the crushing weight of doubt settle over him. How long could they keep this up? How long could they keep searching a forest that seemed to grow darker, more oppressive, with each passing day? And if Chloe was still out there, why had she not left any sign of herself? Why had not they found anything? It was as if she had simply vanished into the trees, swallowed up by the very earth itself. The next day, the group gathered once again, more subdued than before. The search was now a routine, a grim ritual they repeated every day, though they had begun to question its effectiveness. The same paths were traversed, the same areas were searched, and each time they returned to camp with nothing. No clues, no answers. It was on the fourth day of this pattern that the unthinkable happened. As they ventured deeper into the woods, pushing past the thick undergrowth that had once seemed so inviting, they stumbled across something that froze them in their tracks. It was a piece of clothing, Chloe's jacket, left behind in the middle of a narrow trail, as if it had been discarded in haste. Fabric was torn, the zipper half open, as though someone had been in a hurry to leave it behind. There was no sign of Chloe, no sign of a struggle, but the presence of the jacket sent a ripple of dread through the group. Tom picked it up, his hands trembling. "This is hers," he whispered, his voice barely audible. He felt the weight of the fabric in his hands, and the overwhelming sense of loss that came with it. He held it up, inspecting it closely, as if expecting some clue to reveal itself. But there was nothing. No blood. No marks. Thing that could explain what had happened. They stood in silence, the air thick with the unsaid words. The jacket was a sign, but what did it mean? Why would Chloe leave it behind like this? Was she still out there, hiding somewhere in the woods, or had she been taken? And if she had been taken, who or what had taken her? Question echoed in their minds, but no one dared to voice it aloud. There were no answers, only more questions, and the longer they searched, the more the weight of the unknown began to crush them. They could not even trust the land they walked on anymore. The paths were shifting, the forest moving around them as if it were alive, aware of their every step. And yet, the more they searched, the more it felt as though they were being led in circles, caught in a trap they could not escape. By evening, they had returned to camp, the jacket still in Tom's hands. It was a small piece of evidence, but it was a clue a sign that Chloe had not simply wandered off. Something had happened to her, something that had taken her into the heart of the forest and left her lost in its depths. That night, as they sat around the fire once more, the feeling of being watched crept in once again. Flames flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across their faces. But there was no comfort in the warmth tonight. The air felt thick, stifling, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Greg spoke first, breaking the uneasy silence. "We cannot keep doing this," he said, his voice low. "I do not know what is out there, but I do not think it is safe for us to keep searching." Ashley, who had been sitting quietly, stared into the fire. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We cannot just stop. We need to find her." "I know," Greg replied. "But the more we search, the more it feels like we are walking into something we cannot control. Forest is not. It is not like we thought it was. It is changing. We are not supposed to be here." Tom's hand clenched around the jacket, the fabric crumpling in his grip. "We cannot give up," he said, though his words were shaky, uncertain. "Chloe's still out there. We cannot leave her behind." But even as he said it, the truth lingered in the air. There were no answers. The woods were hiding something, and they were running out of time. Days blurred into each other, each one heavier than the last. What had begun as a desperate search for Chloe had morphed into an oppressive, endless quest. There was no turning back now. The woods, which had once seemed like a backdrop to carefree days of campfire stories and starlit nights, had transformed into something far darker. Forest was not just a place anymore. It had become a force, pushed them, twisted their thoughts, and made the air feel suffocating, as though it was trapping them, swallowing their every movement. As the group continued their search, the thin thread of hope they had been clinging to snapped, fraying into something else entirely. Thought of finding Chloe alive seemed less and less likely with each passing hour. But worse than that was the ever-growing sense that they were no longer just looking for a missing person. They were searching for something that could not be found, something that was not meant to be understood. Then, in the unlikeliest of moments, the impossible happened. A figure appeared at the edge of the camp, stumbling through the underbrush like a ghost, half hidden in the shadows of the trees. For a split second, it felt like time had stopped. Everyone froze, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. There, standing in the clearing, was Chloe. She was not the same. She was gaunt, clothes torn, her skin pale and ashen, as though she had been trapped in some far-off place for an eternity. Her eyes, wide and glassy, held a look of confusion, and something darker, something unnameable, that made the blood freeze in their veins, was Chloe. But it was not. Tom was the first to react, rushing toward her, his heart pounding in his chest. "Chloe," he called, his voice hoarse, desperate. But she did not respond. Her gaze remained distant, unfocused. She blinked, slow and unsteady, as if waking from a long, disorienting dream. Her lips parted, but only the faintest of sounds escaped. The words were not right, broken, fragmented, as though her mind could not make sense of the world around her. "Chloe?" Sarah stepped forward, her voice trembling with relief and fear in equal measure. She reached out, touching her friend's arm gently, as if afraid to shatter the fragile moment. But Chloe did not react. She swayed slightly, her body barely holding itself upright, as if the strength to stand had long since abandoned her. "What happened to you?" Sarah whispered, her eyes searching Chloe's for some sign of recognition, something that would assure her that this was real. But Chloe's eyes remained empty, as though she was not really seeing them at all. The others crowded around, unsure of how to respond, their thoughts racing. Had she really been out there all this time? Was she alive? Or was this some twisted version of what she once was? Something that was not entirely her anymore. But no one dared to voice their fears. Not yet. Tom, ever the protector, gently cupped Chloe's face in his hands, trying to bring her back to the present. He asked her questions they had all been waiting to ask, questions that had been gnawing at the edges of their minds. "Where did you go, Chloe? What happened? How did you get here?" But the answers did not come. Her lips trembled, and for a brief moment, It seemed as though she might speak, but the words never came. Instead, she shuddered violently, as though the very thought of speaking was too much for her. Her eyes shifted, her gaze darting to the trees surrounding the camp, as though something there had caught her attention. "Chloe," Sarah said again, this time more firmly, trying to bring her back, to break through the fog of confusion that had taken hold of her. "It is okay. You are safe now. We are here." But Chloe did not respond. She only continued to stare at the trees, her body tense and rigid. It was then that they all felt it, a shift in the air, something that was not quite right, a sudden change in the atmosphere. Forest had been silent before, but now it was almost as if it was breathing, alive with a presence that they could not see but could feel creeping up around them. The shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should, and the wind that had been still for so long suddenly picked up, rustling the leaves in a way that felt far too intentional, as though something unseen was moving through the forest. For a moment, it was as if everything paused. The camp, the forest, the very air, they all held their breath. Tom looked around, his senses on edge, but saw nothing. And yet the sense of being watched, of being hunted, filled the space between his ribs. The others seemed to feel it too. Greg shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the tree line, his muscles tense with anticipation. "Did you hear that?" Greg asked, his voice tight. Sarah nodded, her heart racing. "Yeah. What is it?" The sound was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, like the crackle of distant whispers, a low hum that seemed to emanate from the depths of the forest. It was something foreign, something unnatural. The trees swayed, their branches creaking as if they were shifting in response to some unseen command. Chloe's eyes snapped to attention then, her gaze locking onto the darkened expanse beyond the camp. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her chest rising and falling with panic. It was as if she had heard something they could not hear, something they could not see. She recoiled, her body jerking as if pulled by an invisible force. "We need to go," she murmured, her voice shaking. "We need to leave. Now." Her words sent a shock through the group. Chloe, who had been lost to them for so long, was suddenly speaking with a clarity that was unsettling. And her words, the urgency, the fear in her voice, rang in their ears, echoing with an alarming truth. There was something out there, then, that had taken her, something that had made her return in this broken, lost state. Tom reached out for her, but Chloe pulled away from him violently. "No," she shouted, her voice raw with terror. "You do not understand? It is still here. It is still watching us." Her eyes flicked to the trees again, her breath coming faster. "We cannot stay here. It will not let us leave." The words hung in the air, each one heavy with the weight of something unspeakable. The others exchanged nervous glances, unsure of how to respond, unsure of how to comprehend what Chloe was saying. Could they trust her? Was she speaking the truth? Or had the forest, whatever was out there, done something to her mind, twisted it into something darker? But in that moment, Tom knew that they could not ignore what she was saying. They had been feeling it too, the weight of the forest, the sense that something was lurking just beyond the edges of the camp, watching them. "Chloe," he said softly, his voice steady despite the growing panic inside him. "You are safe now. We are here with you. We will not let anything happen to you." But Chloe only shook her head, her eyes wild. "It is not over," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It is never over." The air around them seemed to hum with an unspoken force, a presence that pressed in from all sides. Trees, once welcoming, now seemed to close in around them, their branches reaching out like claws, drawing them deeper into something they could not escape. And then, without warning, Chloe broke free from their grasp and fled into the woods. It was a desperate, frantic run, her movements erratic as she disappeared into the shadows of the trees. Her voice echoed behind her, a distant cry that seemed to carry the weight of something far darker. "You do not understand," she shouted, her words fading into the distance. "It is too late. It is too late for all of us." The group stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. Tom's chest tightened as he realized that this was not just about Chloe anymore. The woods had taken something from her, something deep and fundamental, and it had left her broken. But whatever had happened to her, whatever had pulled her into the depths of the forest, was still out there, waiting. Without another word, they began to follow her into the woods, each step carrying them deeper into the unknown. They had no choice. Chloe had returned, but not in the way they had hoped. She had brought with her a warning, a truth that was too terrifying to ignore. And now, forest had claimed them all. The forest had become a world of its own, a place where logic and reason no longer held sway. It was a dark labyrinth, a maze that twisted and turned in ways that felt almost deliberate, as though the land itself was shifting to keep them within its grasp. The path Chloe had taken was difficult to trace, and every step they took into the dense woods seemed to lead them deeper into something unknown, something that resisted their attempts to understand it. It was as though the trees themselves were watching, waiting, and perhaps even guiding them to something they could not yet comprehend. They moved through the underbrush in a tense silence, the weight of Chloe's warning still hanging in the air like an ominous cloud. "It is too late," her voice echoed in Tom's mind, a haunting refrain that refused to fade. What had she meant by that? Was she speaking of the forest itself, or something more? The urgency in her voice had been unmistakable, and the fear in her eyes that had once been filled with life, now seemed empty, hollow. She had been changed. The question was, by what? The camp was far behind them now, fading into the distance, and the sounds of the outside world had all but disappeared. All they could hear was the crunch of leaves underfoot, the distant calls of unseen animals, and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. But even that felt strange, as if the forest was no longer just a natural environment but something alive, something with its own will. The deeper they went, the more the shadows seemed to stretch and grow, darkening the spaces between the trunks, wrapping around them like fingers reaching for their skin. As they pushed forward, the air grew heavier, thicker, as though the very atmosphere had become saturated with something darker. It was not just the oppressive weight of the trees overhead, it was the sensation of being surrounded by something unseen, something that was not human, was not even part of the world they knew. It was as if the forest itself was alive, its heart beating beneath the ground, its breath carried on the wind that rustled the leaves. The feeling of being watched intensified with each step they took, like invisible eyes were tracking their every movement, studying them, waiting for the right moment to strike. Tom's mind raced as they moved through the forest. The more he thought about Chloe's words, the more they gnawed at him. She had been out there for days, maybe longer, and something had happened to her, something that had changed her in ways that defied understanding. What had she seen in those woods? What had she felt? And why was she so certain that it was too late? Too late for what? The deeper they walked, the more the landscape seemed to change. The trees, once ordinary and familiar, now took on a strange, almost otherworldly appearance. Their trunks were gnarled, twisted, as though they had been shaped by forces outside the realm of nature. Their branches seemed to stretch unnaturally, their shadows growing longer and darker with each passing minute. The ground beneath their feet, once soft and pliable, had turned to something harder, as if the very soil was resisting their intrusion. It was as if the forest was pushing back, unwilling to allow them to uncover its secrets. The group moved cautiously now, each person feeling the weight of the air, the sense that something terrible was waiting for them. The silence was overwhelming, deafening in its intensity. No birds sang. No insects buzzed. Even the wind seemed to have stilled, as if holding its breath. The world felt suspended, as though time itself had slowed down, leaving them trapped in this place where nothing made sense. As they pushed further into the heart of the woods, they came upon a clearing, an unnerving, natural space where the trees seemed to bow inward, forming a nearly perfect circle. The ground here was smooth, unnaturally so, as though the earth itself had been pressed flat by some unseen hand. There was no sign of Chloe, but the air was thick with something else, something that sent a chill crawling down their spines. The clearing felt wrong, as if it had been intentionally created, intentionally shaped to draw them in. It was too perfect, too symmetrical, like something from a dream or a nightmare. Without thinking, Tom stepped into the center of the clearing, his feet sinking slightly into the soft, almost sponge-like earth. The others hesitated, their eyes scanning the edges of the circle, where the shadows seemed to grow deeper. They knew better than to move too quickly, but Tom felt an overwhelming compulsion to enter, as though the space was calling to him. His gaze flicked nervously from one person to the next, but no one spoke. No one dared to voice the thought that was on all their minds. They were not alone here. The atmosphere in the clearing felt oppressive, thick with an unseen presence. It was as though the very air itself was charged with an electric hum, a low vibration that they could feel deep in their bones. Their footsteps, once light and cautious, seemed to echo unnaturally in the stillness, as though the ground was alive, recording every movement. The weight of the silence pressed down on them, and yet there was no time to question it, no time to second-guess what was happening. And then it happened. Sound, faint but unmistakable, came from somewhere within the trees surrounding them. First, it was like a low, guttural hum, a vibration in the air that sent a tremor through their bodies. Then it became clearer, a voice, but not one they recognized. It was too low, too distant, as though it were coming from the earth itself, or from the very heart of the forest. The voice seemed to circle around them, coming from every direction, and yet there was no one to be seen. "Chloe?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling, but the word hung in the air unanswered. The voice continued, an eerie whisper that seemed to beckon them deeper into the forest. Tom's chest tightened as he glanced nervously at the others, his instincts screaming at him to leave, to turn back. But something held him there, something he could not explain. The fear had settled into his bones, cold, unsettling sensation that he could not shake. "Is it her?" Greg asked, his voice barely audible, as if the very act of speaking would draw the unknown presence closer. No one responded, but the voice, if it could even be called a voice, seemed to grow louder, more insistent, as though it were calling them. "Come closer," it whispered, though the words were distorted, twisted by the wind or the trees, or maybe something far darker. "Come closer." The others stiffened, and for a moment, Tom thought he saw something move at the edge of the trees, a shadow darting between the trunks. When he blinked, it was gone, as though it had never been there. Without thinking, Sarah stepped forward, her feet crunching against the dry leaves and twigs beneath her. The others followed, drawn by the same inexplicable pull that had led them into the clearing. They were not sure what they were walking toward, or what would happen when they reached it. But they knew they could not stop. Not now. Forest closed in around them, the shadows swallowing them whole, and the air grew even thicker, the whispers growing louder until they were almost deafening. Every step they took felt heavier, as if the earth itself was resisting them, holding them in place, as though they were trespassing in a place they should not be. It was a suffocating feeling, like the very forest was pushing them forward, urging them to keep going. Trees seemed to bend closer, their branches reaching out as if they had minds of their own. Clearing that had once seemed so wide and open now felt suffocatingly small, the shadows creeping in closer, almost tangible, as if they were alive and pressing against them. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the whispers stopped. The air was still, too still, and the sound of their breathing seemed too loud in the silence that followed. Tom looked around, his heart hammering in his chest. Something was wrong, far more wrong than he had ever anticipated. The forest was not just a place. It was not just a collection of trees and animals. It was something else, something far older and far more dangerous. They were no longer in control here. They were at the mercy of something that had been waiting for them, something that was now closing in on them, step by slow, inexorable step. "What is this place?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if the very words could summon whatever was hiding in the trees. No one had an answer, and no one dared speak further, for fear of drawing attention to themselves. And then, through the oppressive silence, came a sound, a distant cry, a human cry, rising and falling in the distance. It was faint at first, like a soft wail carried on the wind. But as it grew louder, they realized with a sudden, horrifying clarity. It was Chloe. She was out there, somewhere in the forest, and she was calling to them. The fear in her voice was unmistakable, the desperation echoing in every cry. "Chloe!" Tom shouted, his voice cracking. "Chloe!" But the words seemed to vanish into the air, swallowed by the forest as if they had never been spoken. And then, for the first time since they had entered the woods, The trees parted. The moment the trees parted, it was as if the forest itself had granted them access to something forbidden. The space they stepped into was like nothing they had seen before, a surreal clearing that seemed to exist outside the boundaries of time and reality. There was no sound now, not even the rustle of the wind. The air was thick with a heavy stillness that clung to them, as though every breath they took was being absorbed into the very earth beneath their feet. It felt like they had crossed into a different world, one that was ancient and untouchable, where the laws of nature were twisted, where the rules no longer applied. Chloe's cries continued, but now they seemed more distant, as though they were coming from all directions, spiraling around them like echoes in a vast empty chamber. Her voice had changed. It was no longer the frantic, pleading sound they had heard earlier. Now it was hollow, almost detached, as though her consciousness had fractured, slipping between worlds they could not comprehend. The desperation in her calls was still there, but it was tinged with something else, a deep, unsettling sorrow that resonated with every word she uttered. They moved forward slowly, cautiously, the eerie silence pressing against them from every side. The ground here was soft, yielding beneath their feet, but it did not feel natural. The earth was too smooth, almost like a carpet, but the scent of the air was sharp, metallic, like something old and forgotten was buried beneath the surface. The trees that had once seemed so oppressive now appeared distant, almost spectral, their branches twisted in unnatural angles, as though reaching for something just out of reach. The sky above, normally clear and wide in the daylight, was now shrouded in an unnerving twilight, the sun no longer casting its warmth over them, but replaced by an oppressive, unnatural glow that seemed to come from nowhere. As they walked, Tom felt a chill crawl up his spine. His thoughts were heavy, thick with a mixture of fear and confusion. What was this place? Where had Chloe gone? Was she really here? Or had they crossed into a realm they had no right to be in? Every instinct within him screamed to turn back, to escape this suffocating feeling. But the pull was undeniable. It was as if the forest had chosen them to witness something, to be a part of something far larger than any of them had ever imagined. They were no longer searching for Chloe in the same way they had before. Now they were searching for answers that none of them were truly ready to uncover. The whispers had started again, faint at first, like the wind rustling through the trees. But now they were clearer, more distinct. They were not just whispers. They were voices that spoke without words. Their meaning conveyed in a language that felt ancient, that resonated deep within their bones. The language was not one they could understand, but it was familiar somehow, as if it had always been there, buried in their subconscious. It was a feeling of recognition that made their skin crawl, feeling that they had crossed a threshold into something that should have remained unknown. Tom stopped, suddenly, his heart pounding in his chest. He had seen something, heard something. A figure in the distance, barely visible in the fading light, a silhouette standing still between the trees. First, he thought it was Chloe, but as he squinted, he realized the figure was not quite right. It was too tall, too angular, its shape blurred by the shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally around it. The figure did not move, did not acknowledge their presence, but it was there, watching them, its eyes dark and endless. "Do you see that?" Tom whispered, his voice shaking with the realization that they were not alone. Sarah's eyes followed his gaze, her breath catching in her throat as she spotted the figure too. It was as though it had materialized out of the very darkness itself, shape that did not belong in this world. There was no mistaking the unnaturalness of it. The figure did not have the soft edges of a human being, nor did it have the familiar forms of any animal. It was something else, something ancient, something that should not exist. Greg stepped forward, his eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and fear. "What is that?" he asked, his voice barely audible, but the question seemed to hang in the air, unanswered, as if the figure was not there to be understood. The more they stared at it, the more it seemed to fade into the shadows, becoming part of the forest itself. It was not a thing that could be captured with the human eye. It was a presence, a force that existed outside their understanding. The figure slowly began to dissipate, but as it did, a cold wind swept through the clearing, pushing them back. The whispering voices grew louder, surrounding them from all sides, now unmistakable in their urgency. The very air around them seemed to bend and twist, the trees bending inward as if pressing in on them. They were being drawn towards something, pulled into the very heart of the forest, deeper and deeper, and the closer they got, the stronger the sense of dread became. And then, from the shadows, came Chloe's voice again, stronger now, more direct. But this time, it was not a cry for help. It was a warning. "You should not have come here," her voice rang out, clear and sharp, but strangely distant, as if spoken from far away. "You do not know what you have awakened. You do not know what you have disturbed." Tom's heart skipped a beat. Her voice, familiar yet foreign, rattled him. This was not the Chloe they had known. This was something else, something that had been shaped by whatever force had taken hold of her in the woods. She was no longer just a girl lost in the forest. She was a part of it, a part of whatever darkness lurked deep in the heart of this place. "We have to find her," Sarah said, her voice trembling with both determination and fear. She reached for Tom's arm, but he pulled away, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread seep into his every thought. What if they were already too late? What if Chloe was beyond saving? What if they had already crossed the point of no return? But before he could answer, there was a rustling from behind them, followed by a sudden snap of a branch. Tom whipped around, his pulse spiking as he scanned the trees, his eyes searching for anything that could explain the sound. From the shadows stepped another figure, this one more solid, more real than the one before. It was Chloe, but her appearance made his blood run cold. Clothes were torn, her face streaked with dirt and grime. But it was not just her physical appearance that disturbed him. It was the way she moved, slowly, deliberately, as if she was no longer fully aware of what she was doing. Her eyes, once full of life, were now empty, lost, as though she had been hollowed out from the inside. The person standing before them was Chloe, but it was a shadow of the girl they had known, a pale imitation of the bright, curious spirit that had once walked among them. "Chloe," Sarah asked softly, her voice cracking with emotion. "Chloe, please come back to us." But Chloe did not respond. Instead, she stood there, her gaze fixed on them, unblinking, as if they were nothing more than shadows in her periphery. Forest seemed to pulse around them, the trees growing taller, the shadows deepening, as though the very land was absorbing them, drawing them into its depths. Tom stepped forward cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. "Chloe, we are here to help you. Whatever happened to you, we can fix it. Just come with us, please." For a moment, it seemed as though Chloe might respond. Her head tilted slightly to the side, as though she was considering his words. But then, without warning, she took a step backward, her eyes widening in sudden recognition, and a sharp, panicked gasp escaped her lips. "No!" she screamed, her voice trembling with fear. "You do not understand. You do not know what is here." Her hands reached out, almost pleading. "It is too late. It has already chosen you." Before anyone could react, Chloe turned and fled, disappearing into the darkness of the trees. Her voice echoed in the distance, distant and strained. "Run, run before it is too late." They hesitated for a moment, fear and confusion settling in their chests. Tom's mind raced. What had Chloe meant by that? What was she warning them about? And why had she seemed so desperate to get away from them? But there was no time to question it. Chloe had already vanished, swallowed by the forest. And now, with the fear creeping deeper into their souls, they knew they had no choice but to follow. They had no idea what lay ahead or what was watching them from the depths of the trees, but one thing was clear. They had crossed a line, and there would be no turning back now. Pursuit was frantic, driven by fear and a deep-seated need to understand. Tom's heart hammered in his chest as he pushed forward, the others following closely behind, each step bringing them deeper into the maze of the forest. The air around them was thick with tension, the atmosphere so heavy that it felt as though it might collapse on top of them at any moment. The deeper they ventured, the more the forest seemed to close in around them, the trees growing denser, their gnarled branches twisting overhead like the fingers of some ancient creature. It was as though the very land was alive, responding to their presence, shifting and changing in ways they could not understand. Chloe's voice had faded, swallowed by the vastness of the woods, but the echo of her warning lingered in their minds. "Run before it is too late." The words had sent a chill through Tom's bones, the meaning of them still unclear, but the urgency, The terror in her voice was unmistakable. Whatever she had been through, whatever force had taken hold of her in this place, it was something that could not be ignored. They had to find her. They had to understand. The forest around them had become something else entirely, no longer just a wilderness, but a place that felt ancient, cursed. The air was colder now, sharper, as if the trees themselves had absorbed something dark, something old. The silence that had once been oppressive was now replaced by a low hum that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath their feet. It was a sound that was not quite like anything they had ever heard before, low, rhythmic, like the beating of a distant heart. But there was no heart, no source to the sound. It was as though the forest itself was alive, pulsing with some hidden energy, some unspoken force that had been waiting for them. Tom's thoughts were a whirlwind, each one crashing against the other. What had Chloe meant by, "It is already chosen you"? What had she seen out here in the woods? What had been done to her that had changed her so completely? The person who had returned to them was not the Chloe they had known. She had been transformed. Her mind, her body, something had been twisted, and now, as they followed her further into the woods, they realized they were no longer just looking for Chloe. They were looking for answers, answers that they were not prepared to find, answers that would change everything they thought they knew about the world. Trees grew denser still, the branches overhead weaving together to form a canopy that blocked out the light. The deeper they went, the darker it became, the shadows stretching longer, wrapping around them like an inescapable fog. It was a place where the sun could not reach, where the light seemed to bend, absorbed by something darker, something that had a hold over the forest. The path they followed was no longer clear, no longer a trail. They were walking through a place that had been forgotten by time, a place that existed outside of reality. Every step they took was met with resistance. The ground beneath their feet was soft and spongy, the soil giving way with each movement, as if it did not want them there, as though it were trying to swallow them whole. There was no sound in the forest anymore, save for the echo of their own footsteps, the creaking of trees as they swayed in the wind that did not seem to exist. The forest felt alive, but not in any way that could be explained by nature. It was as though something was watching them, something ancient and patient, something that had been waiting for them to find it. Tom's mind raced as they continued forward, but the longer they moved through the forest, the more the sense of dread grew. They were not just being watched, they were being guided. The path they were on, the place they were moving toward, it felt inevitable. The sense of fate pressing down on them was suffocating, and yet they could not stop. There was no turning back now. Chloe had disappeared into these woods for a reason, and they had followed her, stepping into this strange and dark place with the hope of bringing her back. But now, as they ventured further, Tom realized that this was no longer just about finding Chloe. They were on the edge of something far darker, something that had always been here, hidden beneath the surface. The air grew colder still, the temperature dropping with each step until their breath was visible in the thick, unnatural fog that seemed to swirl around them. They could feel the weight of the atmosphere pressing down on them, the air thick with an energy they could not explain. Forest seemed to stretch on endlessly, each turn leading them deeper into its heart, its secrets. It was as if they had crossed a boundary, a threshold that they could never come back from. The further they walked, the more they realized they were not just in a forest. They were in something older, something far more powerful than they could understand. And then, just as Tom's thoughts seemed to spiral into darkness, they heard it again. Chloe's voice, this time clearer, more frantic. It was coming from up ahead, from somewhere in the distance. Her voice was no longer a cry for help, but a series of frantic, broken words, as though she were speaking to them from a place that existed outside of time. "Do not come closer," she called, her voice trembling, cracking. "You do not know what you are walking into. It is already inside of you." Tom's chest tightened at the words, his heart hammering in his chest. The warning was clear now. Chloe was not just lost in the woods. She was not just hiding from something. Whatever had taken hold of her, whatever had twisted her into something else, was now trying to take hold of them as well. Force in these woods, whatever it was ancient, patient, and it had been waiting for them, waiting for this moment. They had crossed into its domain, and now it was drawing them closer, one step at a time. They pushed on, despite the fear that clawed at their insides, the terror that seemed to seep into their very bones. They were no longer just following Chloe, they were being led toward something that was both terrifying and inevitable. Forest was alive with it, the very air humming with the force that had drawn them here. It was as though they had been summoned, as though they were part of something that had been set in motion long before they arrived. The trees parted once again, and they found themselves in a clearing, another clearing, but this one felt different. There was no warmth here, no light, only an oppressive darkness that hung in the air like a shroud. Clearing was vast, the ground smooth and unnatural, the soil soft and giving beneath their feet. It was a place that felt wrong, a place that had been shaped by something outside the natural order. And there, standing in the center of the clearing, was Chloe. But this time, it was not Chloe as they knew her. Her body was twisted, contorted in unnatural ways, her eyes dark and hollow, staring straight ahead with an emptiness that sent chills down their spines. She was no longer the person they had once known. She was a vessel, a conduit for something else, something dark and ancient. The transformation in her was complete. Her skin was pale, stretched tight over her bones, her clothes hanging in tatters around her. She stood there, motionless, as though waiting for them to approach. "Chloe," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. But Chloe did not respond. She simply stood there, her body unmoving, her gaze fixed on something in the distance, something that no one else could see. Tom stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "Chloe, please, we are here to help you. We can still fix this." But Chloe did not respond. Instead, she began to move, slowly at first, her body jerking unnaturally as if it were being controlled by some unseen force. The movement was wrong, distorted, as though her body was not her own. She moved toward them, her steps slow and deliberate, her eyes never leaving the distance. Forest around them seemed to close in tighter, the shadows deepening as Chloe came closer. "We should not be here," she whispered, her voice distant and hollow. "It is too late for all of us. It has already begun." Tom felt his chest tighten, the fear and dread crawling up his throat, choking him. What was she trying to say? What had happened to her out here? And what was it that had begun, as she had said? The words hung in the air like a curse, and the silence that followed felt suffocating. Chloe stopped just a few feet away from them, her eyes still locked on something in the distance. The others stood frozen, unable to move, unable to speak. The air was thick with something they could not name, a presence that seemed to surround them, pressing in from every side. It was as if the forest itself was closing in on them, its roots reaching out, pulling them into its depths. The darkness had claimed Chloe, and now it was coming for them too. And then, with a sudden movement, Chloe turned toward them, her eyes wide and frantic. "Run," she screamed, her voice a guttural, desperate cry. "Run before it is too late." Before anyone could react, she turned and vanished into the trees, disappearing into the darkness that surrounded them. And just like that, the forest was still once more, holding its breath, waiting for them to make their next move.